The Boneyard, Short Fictions of the Morbid and Macabre, written by Jonathan Dunne, narrated for you by the author. Shackled in the Shack. This short story is to be developed as a full-length horror novel, The Shed, slated for publication in 2026. "Bet you can't jump it," Alex teased, elbowing Ben with a grin. Ben smirked, already starting to back away for a running start at the stream infested with hovering clouds of buzzing midges. "Not over here, Ben. Over there, the deepest part." Ben followed Alex's line of vision to a deeper stretch of the stream. His friend's dare gave him second thoughts, but he backed up and made a run for the river, launching himself across the other side. But the second his heels hit the soggy bank, he sunk, lost his balance and fell backwards into the stream. Ben's whoops of shock and Alex's laughter cut through the dense, whispering trees. It was while they were whooping and hollering that the first gust of light wind blew. And just a second later, that unearthly harsh cry came from the forest. The two friends didn't hear the guttural howl coming from somewhere deeper in the pine forest, the kind of noise that shouldn't be coming from a pine forest, more like a pain forest, where Alex and Ben prowled. The pine forest was just behind their neighborhood on the outskirts of Oldcastle. It was just them, and they forgot about the outside world, especially when they came to the pines, as they called it, which was their world during the long summer days. It was an unusually hot summer this year, the air heavy and thick with a damp shroud that clung to skin and stifled breath. They had spent the day egging each other to greater heights of daring lunacy, but the healthy type of lunacy for boys of their age, climbing trees, jumping streams, throwing rocks at targets. Simple stuff for simple times. But things were about to get a little complicated. A breeze blew up and whistled through the pine needles, whispering a silvery message the boys weren't privy to. They traipsed further into the pine forest, far beyond their usual stomping ground. The atmosphere darkened beneath the thickening canopy of prickly pine needles. Ben turned to Alex and asked him for the time, sensing it had become later with the growing gloom. Or perhaps the blowing breeze had blown some kind of subliminal effect over the boy. His instinct was telling him to turn around, fast. On that sultry summer evening, the breeze blew downwind of them, carrying their scent away into the heart of the pine forest. The boys walked until they came to an earthen bank, where something seized their attention. There, almost unrecognizable, was a moss-coated shack of old wood and rusty nails, leaning slightly crooked, with a rusted tin roof. It had been here in the forest for many years, and Mother Nature had gone to work on it. It blended beautifully with the pine forest. "Whoa!" Ben breathed. "Did you know this was here?" "Dunno. We've never been this far." Ben frowned at Alex, not quite sure what that answer meant. "Let's check it out." Tentatively, they stole up on the shack. The two grimy windows were boarded up from the inside, and the door hung loosely in its frame. Each boy chose a window to see through, but the glass panes were too dirty, and the sheet of timber boarded up inside made sure nothing could be seen from the outside. Alex tried to peer through the rotting boards making up the door, which was chained around a bent nail crudely hammered into the doorframe, and Ben uttered a stifled, "Alex!" while frantically beckoning him over to the hole in the door through which the rusted chain passed. "What's that?" Alex sidled up next to his friend and peered through the small gap between the chain links and the cut hole. There was something in the gloom by the far wall. A pale silhouette stood out in the darkness. It shifted. As it did, the boys heard the chink of chains. They exchanged a worried glance. Ben lip-synced, "What is It. Alex tried to get a closer look, but as he shuffled closer to the door, he misjudged the wet stone step, and the tip of his boot slipped off the curve, slapped into a puddle of water, and fell forwards. The door stopped his fall, but the moment Alex's hands leaned in on the decaying door, a frightening and pained howl came from within the shack, followed by frantic chain rattling. Both boys screamed on cue, swiveled away from the door and scampered into the undergrowth. Ben took the lead while Alex followed up the rear. Neither boy dare look back, putting as much distance between them and the shack as quickly as possible. Lungs on fire, Alex fell to the spongy floor of pine needles. I can't run any more. Ben glanced over his shoulder when he stopped hearing his friend's footfalls and skidded to a stop. Fuck, Alex, come on! He turned back and tried to pull Alex to his feet, but his friend was bigger and heavier than he was. Ben dropped to his knees next to Alex, realizing he too was exhausted. They sat there on the forest floor, panting, trying to control their breathing, listening out for that hair-raising scream. But all they could hear were their pulsing temples and heart-beating chests. They sat there in silence, dumbfounded at the horror lurking in the shack. Ben, it... Alex began to hyperventilate. There's someone tied up in there. They didn't have a stitch of clothing on them. We need to go to the police right now. Alex went to get up, but Ben pulled him back to the ground. Alex, something weird's going on. I mean, when have you ever heard a scream like that? I think we should sneak back and find out what's in there first. It looked like a person, but it sounded like an animal. Alex didn't disagree with his friend. He peered sheepishly over his shoulder in the direction they had just run from. By now the sun had begun to set, and dusk had fallen in the gloomy pine forest. Shouldn't we head back? Man, I don't think we should get involved. Ben suggested. Whatever we saw back there is a prisoner, Alex. We both saw it. How can we let them there to suffer? They had both seen what looked like a naked person crouched in the darkness of the shack, but the cry that came from within when Alex lost his footing, well, that was the part confusing them. That piercing wail was the unspoken reason why they were stalling right now. If that howl had come from a human being, then the boys would already be at the police station, stammering their way through what they had just witnessed in the heart of the pines. Alex mulled it over. He didn't look too hopeful. I still think we should go to the police. Ben came up with a plan. Okay, so how about this? We go back there and we collect as much information as we can, then go to the police. We don't really know what we saw, Alex. We freaked and ran. Hey, maybe if we hide out near the shack we can see who the kidnapper is. I'm starting to regret not bringing my phone. Will you stop going on about your phone, Alex? It's at home, and that's the right place for it. We spoke about this. This is our time, not phone time. We can be zombies on our phones at night when there's nothing else to do, but not now. This is real life. You think your best friend on Facebook is going to help you now? It's all an illusion, my friend. Reluctantly, Alex got to his feet and began walking back in the direction they had come from. Ben smiled to himself and tagged along. They walked in silence, and they were so consumed by what was shackled in the shack that the encroaching night was but an afterthought. 10 minutes later, they were back in the clearing. On the other side of the opening, built into the embankment, was the mysterious shack. It stared at them through the gloom. It looked no different from when they had seen it half an hour earlier, but now everything was decidedly darker. The old shed was hardly visible against the background of mottled browns and dark shadows. Drawn like moths to the flame, Ben and Alex stole up once again to that small hole in the door, the same hole through which the rusted chain went and latched onto the nail hammered sideways into the doorframe. But it was Alex who realized something was different. Something had changed during the 30 or so minutes since they had been here. The lock. What about it? Ben asked. Well, there wasn't one. The chain was jammed onto the head of the nail, but now that lock is keeping it closed too. The teenagers considered each other, realizing that someone had been to the shack during the brief time they were away. They turned to the clearing, and their eyes scanned the surrounding undergrowth. They listened out, but all they could hear was the constant rise and fall whistle as the wind filtered through the branches of the pines around them. A stronger gust of wind blew through the forest. Just as it did, a horrifying screech came from the shack, and the walls shook as whatever was in there thrashed and yanked at its manacles. Ben and Alex dived for the closest hiding point behind the large stump of a long-forgotten pine tree. Within seconds of hearing the blood-curdling call, approaching voices filtered in from beyond the earthen ridge on the far side of the opening. They had a bird's-eye view of everything, if they could just keep their cool, only Alex wasn't looking too cool, and had already begun to hyperventilate and sweat profusely. Ben tried to calm him down, and did something they probably wouldn't talk about later, and definitely wouldn't admit to during the police interrogation. He took his best friend's hand in his, and held on tight. This humane touch in an inhumane situation had a profound effect on Alex, and found he could gain control over his erratic breathing. He nodded his thanks. That was enough. Ben gestured to be quiet, as if that was something he needed to do. As he peered around his left shoulder to get a view of the clearing behind the rotting stump, there, moving along the bank from right to left, were the silhouettes of two men. Each man was carrying a large white bucket containing contents Ben wasn't privy to, but judging by their gaits, the buckets were quite full. They walked in silence and with purpose. Meanwhile, without taking his eyes off the couple, Ben was frantically nudging Alex to take a look, so Alex turned to have a peek from the other side of the pine stump. They forgot to breathe as the men trod carefully down the slippery embankment and made for the shed. They stepped up onto the stone step Alex had tripped on and put down their buckets. One of the men hammered the door with the heel of his fist. From inside came that gut-wrenching cry, a lamenting wail that sent the hair standing. For some strange reason, both boys wanted to weep on hearing that forlornly cry. That was something else they wouldn't speak about later. Both men laughed their heads off, apparently finding it very amusing. The individual standing on the right fished for something in his jacket pocket and took out what could only be a key. The man unclicked the lock, and the boys heard the sound of the chain being dragged through the hole. They opened the door, picked up their buckets, and went inside. Both boys couldn't fail to notice how the men made sure the door wouldn't close while they were inside as they pulled across what appeared to be a rock and propped it against the door. That was when the heartbreaking roars started, as the men, clearly its captors, taunted whatever was shackled in the shack. They bellowed and slapped on their buckets, and the thing wailed. Alex, who was always happy to let Ben lead the way, was surprised to see tears in his friend's eyes. For the first time ever, Ben was overcome by a situation. "Are you okay, Ben?" Alex's question had a profound effect on Ben, as if a tap had been opened somewhere inside him. The lad began to blubber and weep. Tears streaked down his red cheeks. Snot flowed from his nostrils. It's so sad." These devastatingly simple words brought tears to Alex's eyes. "What's in there, Ben? Who are they?" Ben emphasized. "That's what I want to know. Who are they? What do they have trapped in there?" Alex wiped the tears from his eyes and sat up. "I have a plan, but it's a little crazy. I'm listening." As Ben listened to his friend's plan, his eyes widened to shock, and by the time Alex had finished telling his possible plan of action, Ben was staring at his best friend, wondering who Alex was exactly, and if he'd ever really known him, as what was coming out of his mouth now wasn't the normal Alex. "Are you serious right now?" "I think it's the best plan. Like I said, it makes perfect sense." And even though Ben was terrified to carry out Alex's lunacy, He had to admit that it really was the perfect solution. "Are you in or out?" The whole world seemed to disappear for Ben just then. The world of the pines and the world of Oldcastle and beyond. It was just them now against these bad men. Ben's heart was racing. His whole body tingled with electricity, thinking that they could be the heroes in all of this. Alex had used that very word, heroes. Maybe it was to convince him. He sneaked another peek at Alex, who seemed to become someone else, now that they were under pressure. Ben had the chance to be a hero. The closest he came to being a hero was in his video games, and nobody was fooling anybody here because all of that was just fantasy. This was reality, and people would be talking about him for the rest of his life in the town of Oldcastle. "Ben, in or out?" "In. I'm in, Alex." Alex nodded. He turned around to look at the shack. The men were still standing in the doorway, taunting and shouting abuse at their chained prisoner. "When I say go." Ben nodded. By now he thought he was going to pass out. They waited until the men went inside the darkness of the shack. "Now," whispered Alex. The boys materialized from behind the pine tree stump and made a runner for the embankment. Once at the top of the mound above the shed, Alex took the left while Ben took the right, tiptoeing their way down. Now Ben and Alex were standing on either side of the open door. One of the men could come walking out any second and catch them red-handed. Inside the shack, they heard one of the men telling the other to be careful and not get too close. To their horror, the teenagers realized that the men were feeding the prisoner from whatever was in those buckets. Ben and Alex listened to a frenzy of chomping, guzzling, and the crack of what sounded very like splintering bone. While the cacophony of feasting was going on, the men howled and laughed and slapped the sides of the walls. The noises that came from within were inhumane, as the thing howled and feasted at the same time, producing a hair-raising symphony from the shack. By now the boys were beginning to deduce that what was in those white buckets was something a butcher shop might throw out, offal and bone. Maybe they were beginning to doubt what they were about to do. If they were, none of them gave any inclination. But those terrifying noises coming from the feasting creature, coupled with the taunting men, was enough to send a grown man running for cover. Alex gave Ben the signal with a nod of his head. From the left-hand side of the door, Ben appeared at lightning speed, grasped the rock and flung it to the side. Alex, in turn, grabbed the door and pulled it out with a bang. Ben fumbled with the chain, trying to get it fastened onto the nail. The men fell against the door, trying to pull it in to open it. But that side of the door didn't have any handle, and they were grasping at the boards with their nails. Alex swiped the chain from Ben and managed to knot it around the bent nail. Then Ben sealed the deal by closing the lock which had been dangling from the chain. One of the men threatened, "I'll cut your fucking throats when I catch up with you both. I saw enough of you to recognize you when I see you again. Let us out." Unmistakable desperation crept into his last plea. The threat was followed by frantic whispering, coming from behind the door, before a second friendlier voice said, "Boys, come on and let us out. You've had your fun. Let us go and we'll forget this ever happened." He tried pleading with the boys, telling them they would let them go if they'd just let them out. "It only seems fair. You let us go and we let you go. Right, Danny?" Pause. "Right, Danny?" "Right," came the hesitant, gruff answer. Ben and Alex stalled, eyeing each other, not sure who to believe, but they were more inclined to believe the first speaker, who threatened to have their throats slit. This time it was Ben to call the shots, flashing his thumb over his shoulder before breaking into a sprint. Alex didn't need an invitation and took off at his friend's heels. Behind them, they briefly listened to desperate pleas to be let out, accompanied by those goose-prickling banshee wailings. But instinct was in the driving seat now, and the boys were running for their lives in the direction of town. It was almost pitch dark by now, and they had no choice but to slow down for fear of running into a tree or tripping over a fallen branch. Even when they were exhausted and slowed to a march, no words passed between the boys. They were sticking to Alex's plan, and they both knew where they were heading. Half an hour later, Ben and Alex were storming through the front doors of the local police station where they met Tom Daly, a.k.a. Big Tom Daly, police sergeant, and aspiring bluegrass musician. Through frantic bullet points, the boys managed to tell the police sergeant that they had trapped 2 kidnappers who were holding, and this is where they paused for thought, something in an old shack deep in the pine forest. Big Tom's reaction was to have a good old chuckle at the boys, pointing out that they were now the kidnappers. They hadn't thought about that. But the police sergeant wasn't taking any of this very seriously anyway, until that chuckle dried up to a click in his throat when he asked the boys to describe the men they had seen. It was clear to the teenagers that the police sergeant knew who they were referring to, but he never came out and said it at any point in the subsequent investigation, which would flare into national and international headlines in just hours from now. The change in his demeanour was startling, reduced from a larger-than-life, pudgy, chuckling man to a quiet and pensive individual. He picked up a banjo on a stand next to his desk and idly plucked at the strings as he stared off into space with a worried expression. Somewhere along the way, the police sergeant had a run-in with these two. Looking out the window, he asked, "Could you take me to the shack now?" A sense of urgency had slipped into his cadence. "In the dark?" Alex asked doubtfully. The police sergeant nodded. "Time is of the essence, boys. All of this might be over by morning. We need to catch them in the act." Ben and Alex assured Big Tom that they could. The police sergeant asked 2 other police officers to accompany them, and before the teenagers knew what was happening, they were sitting in the back of a squad car on the way to the Pine Forest entrance, not far from the entrance to the national park. The squad car pulled up, and they entered the Pine Forest, led by 4 powerful flashlights held by each member of the law, while Alex and Ben shared theirs. The Pine Forest was a scary place at night, silence save for the wind blowing through the treetops. Ben and Alex loved the pines, but not at night. It felt like a different place in the darkness, and Alex jumped on numerous occasions, thinking he had seen a face peering out from behind a tree, but it was only his imagination. Or was it? Half an hour later, they were standing on the edge of the clearing, 4 flashlight beams lighting up the sinister old shed. But now there was a problem. Alex and Ben thought they were seeing things as they approached the derelict building. Perhaps the flashlights were playing with their sense of space, coupled that with the dancing shadows and the cones of light. But no. Their worst nightmare became reality when they saw the broken door. 2 of the boards were shattered with jagged splinters. As they drew closer, the teenagers came to a stop on seeing the blood streaks smeared along the broken wood, and more of the crimson stuff on the wood slivers. The 3 members of the local police shone their flashlights on the battered door and the blood that strangely looked like war paint. "They got away!" Ben exclaimed, his panic-stricken face illuminated in their flashlights. Big Tom and the others shone their lights out into the circle of trees. Branches swayed, shadows danced, and the wind whistled through the pine needles. By now, both boys were starting to feel that something was missing. It felt too quiet, too silent. "Look here." The policeman going by the name of Stone beckoned Big Tom and the policewoman over to a spot in the clearing. The boys followed his flashlight on a trail of blood leading away into the undergrowth. Alex erupted. "We've got to catch them!" "Boss," came the policewoman's voice. "Boss, over here." Everyone turned to see the policewoman standing in the shack doorway. "What is it, Maggie?" the police sergeant asked. The policewoman snapped, "Just get over here now!" The group moved towards the open, broken doorway when Maggie held up her free hand. "No, not the boys." She turned to Alex and Ben. "Just stay over there. You're fine where you are. You don't need to see this." The teenagers did as they were asked while the others went into the shack and stalled in the doorway. "Jesus Christ," they heard Big Tom mutter. Policeman Stone turned away and just made it outside where he threw up. The boys didn't have time to turn away and were sickened to their stomachs by the sight of the policeman vomiting into his flashlight. They watched the policeman wipe his mouth with the sleeve of his uniform jacket and go back inside almost mechanically. From their vantage point in the clearing, they heard muttered whispering coming from the shed. and Stone's empty wretches. But they were acutely aware that they were alone out here now. The boys huddled closer. It was Alex's turn to carry the flashlight, and he scanned the surrounding pines and along the embankment for any sign of movement. Something moved through his beacon of light over on the embankment, like a ghost gliding from left to right before fizzling into the tree line. Ben! Alex stared so hard, laser-focused on the mound, that he began to wonder if it was just a figment of his imagination. He nudged his friend to verify what he'd just seen, but he elbowed thin air. Ben! What? He turned away momentarily to see Ben's silhouette standing behind the police in the doorway. Just standing there, frozen. Ben fled the scene and came running into Alex's light beam in pale-faced terror, screaming for his life and stuttering for the first time ever. They're in pieces. Arms and legs. A screaming head. Just the mouth open. I saw one of their heads, Alex. It stared at me. Numb shock shut Alex down. He dropped his flashlight. For a moment, none of this computed for him, until he realized it wasn't the men who had gotten away, but the shackled thing chained to the wall, crying out and glutting on whatever was in those buckets. And the second thing he considered was the silent screaming head Ben spoke of, staring dead-eyed at him from the cold, damp floor of the A stirring cry of grief screamed out at them from the trees. That howl seemed to come from all around them as they stood there in the clearing, vulnerable and petrified. The 3 members of the local police force scanned the undergrowth with trembling beacons of light. The pines circling them took on lives of their own, and it seemed to the boys, and only the boys, that the pines themselves were closing in on them, closing that circle that would never be closed, now that it had been opened. "There!" Stone cried in a frantic, hushed whisper. "Look!" He began to stutter, unable to construct another word. The police sergeant and policewoman drew their flashlights to the point in the tree line where the police's beacon of light landed. There, peering out at them from behind a tree, was a sickly pale face, an oozing, downturned mouth with red streaks, and large dark eyes, nocturnal eyes. "Oh, dear Jesus," whispered Big Tom Daly, undiluted fear in his voice. "What is it? Someone escaped from the hillside?" It might have been funny under different circumstances, but the police sergeant was grasping at reality, searching for some kind of logical answer to this illogical anomaly staring at them. Everyone present, including the teenagers, knew this was no escaped patient from the local psychiatric hospital. Big Tom was reaching, desperate to find answers where there weren't any. Granted, the hillside had some questionable characters, but this wasn't one of them. Policewoman Maggie couldn't bring herself to speak, reduced to throat-clicking sobs. Her flashlight shook uncontrollably, despite grabbing her right hand with her left to steady herself. Then it screamed at them, howled at them. The melancholy brought them to tears, and despite the abomination before them, they found it in their hearts to feel pity for this monster. And then it was gone, disappearing into the night. None of the police, including the sergeant, was in any hurry to chase whatever they had just witnessed, despite the fact that it had just ripped 2 grown men to pieces. Big Tom would say at a later date, "We were dealing with an unknown quantity, and we weren't equipped." As the weeks and months went by, Alex would wake in the middle of the night seeing that yanked head floating about the shack that would become his bedroom. He wasn't sure if he might have been better off to see the actual head, find some level of catharsis, closure, or whatever word the brain doctors use to describe the phenomenon in which it is better to see a real horror than have an imagined one turn stagnant and infect the brain. But that open-mouthed head haunted him for some time, never left him, in fact. Just as his best friend's terrified expression in his flashlight that night never left him truly at peace. And speaking of Ben, well, he wouldn't be so lucky, and suffered a mental break on witnessing the carnage and cartilage in the shack. He should have taken policewoman Maggie's advice in staying back. But curiosity killed the cat, and Ben was never a good listener anyway. It was a rude awakening, and a hard lesson to swallow. These days, Ben is a long-term patient at the psychiatric hospital, the hillside, out on the coast road. But the worst of all is that the creature, whatever it was, is still roaming the pine forest on the edge of town. Perhaps it has made its way into the national park. Anyone lucky or unlucky enough to hear its lonesome call find themselves breaking down into tears, somehow understanding wherever it is from is a long way from home, and it kills because it has to. Ben and Alex never became the heroes they thought they would become.